Hey guys, welcome back to another one of my show and tell videos. This time we're looking at the Daedalus-Class as it appears in Pacific 201. Now you'll see immediately, if you're familiar with the Daedalus-Class, there are differences in this than there are in the classic version. And that's because I've not only redetailed it to make it consistent with the design language of Pacific 201, but I've also rearranged it, and we can justify that as a refit or as the result of multiple refits. But one thing that always bugged me about the Daedalus-Class was that the primary hull is connected higher, and it gives it this really forward-heavy look that kind of makes it look like it's going to tip over. And I know that's not really a consideration in space, but it always felt awkward to me. So the first thing I did was I moved the primary hull down so that it shared a common axis with the secondary hull, and then I added a second support to kind of bulk up the whole look. If you're interested, actually, yeah, I'll just put up a render of this specific Daedalus-Class arranged like the classic one, you know, just for this video. But I think that in general gives it a much more balanced look that almost kind of saves the design. I tell people there's a reason why the Daedalus-Class is based on rejected Matt Jefferies concept art for the original series. It's not an attractive ship, and I do think, I've said this before, I do believe that's a reason why it has kind of a fan base at all, is because it's kind of like the ugly ship that could. And I totally get that. When I say a ship is ugly, I don't really necessarily mean that's a dig against it, because that kind of is almost it's almost realistic, you know. Ships should not be designed to look cool. They should be designed to be functional, and an ugly ship kind of suggests that, you know, maybe there's a good functional reason why it looks that way, and it kind of makes it feel more real to me. Now, I built out the Daedalus-Class to represent Captain Demir's previous command. Now, Captain Demir is the captain of the Pacific, but his previous command was the starship August, which is a Daedalus-Class, and that is this ship, though there's actually no text on this model, and that's kind of evidence that this model isn't actually the texturing work on this model is not 100% complete. But I hope you'll forgive me. But let's put that behind us and kind of go into some of this stuff. I guess we can just start with the bridge, work down, and work back. Up here, the bridge is where we expect it to be, deck 1. And you'll notice all these windows. There's a window in the front, there's windows in the top. Ignore the kind of slapdash texture that represents the interior. This ship is going to be seen from a distance, so it doesn't really matter so much. But anyway, these windows are not connected to the bridge. The bridge is kind of located in here, and it's actually a very small bridge, because there's a line that Captain Demir says where he says that the bridge of the Pacific is more spacious than the bridge of the August, and the bridge of the Pacific is only like 20 feet wide. It's actually pretty small for a Starfleet bridge. So the Daedalus-Class apparently has a smaller bridge than that, and it's actually interesting. One of my original concepts for Pacific 201 was actually to make the bridge tiny. I envisioned it that the captain could sit in his chair and actually almost reach and touch all of the officers around the chair. Eventually, I thought that's not going to really work in terms of space for filming, but maybe now that concept art is what the Daedalus-Class bridge would look like. Moving down, we see this black ring. This is a deflector shield emitter. This is kind of the detail I've decided upon for the Pacific 201 interpretation of Star Trek. The Pacific has lots of these dark gray ribbed rings that represent the same thing, so I include that detail in the Daedalus-Class as well. So let's move down here. These are torpedo launchers. There's 2, and I'm not sure how sensible it is to put them basically directly below the bridge. Maybe I ought to have put them down like in the equator, but of course I could always come up with some justification for why they're here. Maybe there's a really specific reason why that's the case. Let's kind of orbit this way. We'll get to the deflector later. I like to put these kinds of details on my ships. These like external hatches with like handrails that suggest spacewalks or external maintenance and stuff like that. Here's a hatch for a beam weapon. There's 4 of them. There's one there, and they're on the other side as well. And if you want to see this model in action, there's a video on the Pacific 201 channel about tactical systems and phasers and torpedoes, and this model is shooting phasers and firing torpedoes and stuff like that, and you see them coming out of these areas. These are actually deployed in that video. We, of course, have an airlock for actually attaching you know, hard attachment point for star bases or docking with other ships. And the whole equator is filled with like these equipment bays. I like the feel of the idea of like plug and play mission specific sensor palettes and stuff like that. So let's move to the Deflector Dish, which is a pretty classic Deflector Dish. It's got that gold look and also that white look that I've been using for Pacific 201 stuff. Now, the Daedalus-Class doesn't actually canonically have a dish like this, though we can imagine it might be behind a panel or something like that. But a lot of people do put the dish into their reinterpretations of the Daedalus-Class, and I'm never going to pass up an opportunity to add extra surface detail, especially if it fits in with a accepted Star Trek convention. Down here we see another one of those deflector shield rings and a sensor dome, like the original series or Enterprise. So let's move back. I'm going to change the angle here. Now we're looking at the engineering section. I guess it's kind of shrouded in shadow. I apologize for that. The engineering section is this entire rectangle right here. And I really like having visible technology and stuff that you can look at and see and that makes sense from the outside. So in here would be the warp core, and these pipes here are plasma conduits that power the primary hull. And then you would have conduits that go port and starboard that power the impulse engines and the warp engines. And an idea I had for the Daedalus-Class, and I talk about this in a video, though the Daedalus-Class in that video is a slightly older version of the model. This is the Daedalus-Class in the Pacific 201 context is supposed to be a test bed for like a new power system where the warp core powers everything. It's completely antimatter powered, and you know, I guess that was considered to be, you know, far easier to maintain. You didn't have different types of power or different types of equipment for different types of systems. You know, famously, like Apollo 13 had different carbon dioxide scrubber equipment for the command module and the landing module, and it caused a major problem when things went wrong in space. And it's a different kind of system, but I thought, well, maybe Starfleet is trying to protect against incompatible equipment with fusion reactors and matter-antimatter reactors, and they made this, you know, combined system. But we know that later, impulse engines are traditionally powered with fusion reactors, and the warp core is a matter-antimatter reactor that powers the engines. So maybe they backtracked and thought maybe redundancy or, you know, different systems is better, because if your warp drive goes down, then you're completely immobilized. It's not like, well, we still have impulse power. So maybe they backtracked on that. I like using simple shapes. So for instance, the impulse engines are, you know, perfect squares, and the whole module is just basically a rectangle. And I think there's an element of believability to a piece of equipment that's just a regular shape. It doesn't need to be weirdly tapered or overly detailed. And I did that as well with the secondary hull. And of course, the actual canonical Daedalus-Class has a regular cylinder for its secondary hull, and I preserved that. I didn't think there was any reason to make it look cooler, because the cylinder to me looks cool because it looks practical. It looks like, oh, well, they're maximizing their available space. You know, it doesn't have any weird cutouts like the original series Enterprise does. It doesn't have any weird bends or folds like the NX class does. It's just a cylinder, and it makes a lot of sense. Now it's a cylinder with a little rectangle on top for the engineering and stuff. But still, let's move on to the warp engines. Here we see I continue my tradition of not having lit Bussards, and my explanation for that is I think it looks kind of cartoony to have the lit Bussard collectors. And I always say it's the Pacific 201 interpretation of the Star Trek world. Now, I do try to design everything so that it's believably still prime Star Trek, and I do think that that's the case, but I try to connect it more to original series than I do to Enterprise. I'll just say that, like, the original series Enterprise, they have the freedom to have completely exposed Bussards, which are more efficient and they can collect more deuterium, but that's fragile technology that up until now we've had to hide behind panels that restrict the effectiveness of that particular technology. So there's technological progression suggested in the fact that the Enterprise kind of has the freedom to show off its flashy disco domes, and the Daedalus-Class and the Pacific don't. We of course have warp coils and the vents that have clear line of sight to each other as per those design rules that are already inconsistently followed, but, you know, you still want to do things ostensibly. And back here, of course, we have the classic balls that are at the ends of the original series Enterprise, but I've put them in a shroud, just like the ones on the Pacific. Oh, and right, there's a traditional shuttle bay on this one as well. And down here, there's also like a drop bay, but it's not anywhere close to the shuttle bay. And I'm thinking maybe this down here is cargo, or perhaps it's for extra modules to, you know, you open up and you kind of have like a plug-and-play expansion bay with equipment down here. I had the idea that the Daedalus-Class is this, you know, completely prototype test bed for all these new ideas. And my thought is that Starfleet pretty much unanimously recognizes the Daedalus-Class as failing at all those new ideas. And that's why the Daedalus-Class is kind of an anomaly in Starfleet design progression, because they just did something completely new and maybe it didn't work out so well, so they went back. Because at this time, nothing has been standardized yet for Starfleet. The NX-Class, okay, we have a saucer, but no other ships before the NX-Class had a saucer, and my Romulan warships don't have saucers. So maybe when Starfleet starts making exploratory vessels again, which I placed the Daedalus-Class after the Romulan War, there's no standard. So they make something that's its own thing. It's new. They're kind of still exploring different directions. But for their next exploratory vessel, the Integrity-Class, which is, you know, the Pacific, they go back to more familiar territory. But that's the Pacific 201 Daedalus-Class. People really like the Daedalus-Class. I'm actually pretty happy with how this came out. I'm surprised at how many angles it actually looks good at. I'm not a huge fan of the front and side angles, but almost every other angle has its merits. And if you guys want to explore this 3D model, I actually have private models on Sketchfab, which is an awesome site for sharing and exploring 3D work. And I give out the link to those private models on my Patreon as a special thank you to people who support me on a monthly basis. If you'd like to support my work, check me out on Patreon. Every single contribution makes a huge difference to the sustainability of this work. I've got subscriptions and hardware that I've got to pay for, and that makes a massive difference. So sharing these models is just the least I can do as a thank you for people who support me there. If you like these kinds of videos, please subscribe. I plan on doing these show and tell videos once a week. I've got lots of work. I've got more stuff from Pacific 201. I've got other Star Trek ships. I make lots of that kind of stuff just for fun. I've got Star Wars stuff. I've got original sci-fi stuff. So subscribe so you don't miss when I post those. And I also do discussions and video essays on Star Trek and Star Wars and other sci-fi occasionally. So check those out if you want. And thanks for watching. Thanks for liking. Thanks for commenting. And I'll see you next time.